It's late afternoon in Helsinki and it's very early morning in Canada, where we have our main speaker. And this thematical session addresses Indigenous sovereignties and Indigenous alternatives at different levels. Indigenous sovereignty and autonomy have become major political aspirations for Indigenous movements worldwide, as you know, since the 70s, but still today, these are very important questions. Indeed, self-determination of Indigenous peoples remain a major unresolved issue, and decolonization often remains only a metaphor, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Young have noted. So in this session, we really address the fact that Indigenous territories and livelihoods are increasingly threatened by transnational corporate powers and also dominant nation states structures. Indigenous movements, organizations and activists have actively resisted the capitalist coloniality and neoliberal globalization and tried to construct viable epistemological, ecological, sociocultural, political and economic alternatives to the use of natural resources and to the ways of thinking of the territoriality. So in this session, we have one main speaker, Professor Deborah McGregor from the York University in Canada, and we have three different discussions. So we have first three set of invited comments, and then in the end we will open the floor for Q&A, and there will be plenty of time for your questions in the end. And please also use the chat during the talk of Deborah if you have any comments, reflections, or if you come up with any questions related to the discussions, comments and questions. But Deborah will start, and her main questions are here. What are Indigenous contributions that have been made to the dialogue on global extractivism and environmental crisis, and to the critiques of proposed solutions? And she also asks, how do the alternatives look like from Indigenous points of view, and what kind of ecological futures or climate futures Indigenous peoples imagine? Let me introduce shortly Professor Deborah McGregor. As I said, she works at the York University in Canada, and she's an Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island in Ontario. Her research has focused on environmental justice, forest policy and management, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, water and environmental governance, and recently she has also addressed climate change with focus on gender and youth. This has been her recent research focus. She is a co-editor of Indigenous Peoples and Autonomy, Insights for Global Age, that she co-edited with Mario Blasser and Ravi de Costa and William Coleman. And she's also author of numerous articles. She has also been an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Toronto, and engaged in community-based research methodologies and in their development. Her talk today is Indigenous Peoples, Colonialism and Climate Change Futures, and soon she will start, but let me introduce shortly also our discussants. So the first set of comments will come from Hanna Kuttorm, who is senior researcher at in Indigenous Studies at this university. And she is really inspired by Indigenous ontologies, epistemologies, post-theories, and in general, how do we do our research? How do we write and how we present our research results? Then we have comments by Eija Ranta, who is a researcher in global development studies, and her research has addressed complex articulations between development, politics, and power. And then we have Paula Minoya, who is a lecturer also in global development politics. And her work is very much related to post-development, political ecology, and participatory research. So now the floor is yours, Deborah. I'm very happy that you are here with us. We have been exchanging quite a lot during, I think, is it already 2 years? So press Pohtiin, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I welcome everyone to this session because now that we live in a virtual world, sometimes we do need to have a little break between sessions. And yeah, part of our conversation was this was all supposed to happen in person, and it didn't. So thank you for making it work, and everyone for participating in this new virtual way that we currently exist. Yeah, so I want to thank you for inviting me and people who've taken the time to participate and organize and figure out the technology, and the discussants who sort of had to read a paper at the last minute, and hopefully I'm coherent in my thinking because there's a lot going on in my head, and I'm trying to I will do a PowerPoint because it does keep me somewhat logical and coherent, because you do have to think slightly when you're doing them. But before I start, I did want to acknowledge I am in my territory. I am in Birch Island. I do live and work in Toronto a lot of the time, but I'm at home. So in terms of land acknowledgement, I am in my own community. I am lucky to be in Anishinaabe and live and work in my own communities. And I just ask people just to reflect on where they are and who the Indigenous peoples are. We're still alive. We're still here. And acknowledge the struggles, and not only the struggles, but the kind of futures that they seek to, that they desire for future generations. So what I wanted to talk about, the reason I gave this title to the talk was because I work a lot with youth. One of the things a lot of the elders and traditional knowledge holders that I work with is that you don't really just like lay out all the bad stuff happening. You always have to talk about like where the hope is and where the future is, and try to envision what that is. A lot of Indigenous communities in Canada are dealing with multiple crises. A lot of them have declared climate emergencies, including the Assembly of First Nations, which is a national organization that represents over 600 First Nations. So you always want to leave people with hope. And so where I try to frame some of this is introducing the idea of Indigenous legal traditions and knowledge. I think generally internationally there's some recognition of Indigenous knowledge. You do see that, and it's been around in the UN world for several decades, but not so much laws, even though you see it in what Indigenous people say. So part of my work now is focused on trying to I guess more clearly delineate what some of those laws are and codify them so that they're more, I guess, visible to others, so they can start trying to understand them. And I think to some extent those actually help explain where we see conflict, at which there's like big major one going on in Canada at the moment. So with that, yeah, so thank you for joining, and I will now share the screen. Make sure I know how to do this properly. Yes, so I'm seeing it on mine, so I'm hoping everybody else is, right? Like, okay.
Yes, we have it.
Okay, good. And let's just make sure that it actually changes when I want it to. Okay, so yeah, so thank you for having me, and I do want to talk about where some thinking around, some Indigenous scholars and actually communities are thinking about where they think climate futures can happen in the context of what we're facing, because it doesn't look good. And that's sort of like my first few slides is, what's the planetary health? What's the situation that we're in? So most of you are probably familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not looking good, the 2018 report. the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, the same thing. Now, what's really interesting about these, well, there's a lot of interesting things about them, but I think what struck me in reading these reports and trying to get an understanding of the state of the world and the planet is that they're calling for major transformation. That's what they're calling for. Like, they're basically saying business as usual isn't working. Tweaking the business as usual, the status quo, the global economic order, the way that we collectively, I guess as humans, are functioning, that's not solving the problem, that there needs to be transformation. And I think especially the IPBES report sort of tries to give some suggestions for what that looks like. So when I reflect on these reports, I think about what can that transformation look like that's being called for. And that calls for, you know, imagination and a different way of thinking and being in the world. So I don't want to, like, you know, in my first thing in the morning or your afternoon say, things aren't looking good. They're not, but they also said we need to transform. And what does that look like? And that's where I think there could be, you know, contributions from Indigenous peoples. And because, as I'll point out later, because Indigenous peoples have had to face what everybody else is now facing for centuries, and we had to transform to survive. So I think there's some things to learn from what that transformation can look like. I just pulled up these images because often what happens, and these are in the Canadian context, Indigenous lands and territories and lives become the sacrifice zones. This is like in Northern Canada, particularly like where I live in Ontario, that's where Indigenous peoples live. And that's where a lot of the resource development, extraction type of activities tend to take place. So people decide who's going to benefit and not benefit from these kinds of activities. So there becomes these kind of sacrifice zones. And the reason I mention that in some of the circles that I'm in, where people are trying to green everything, green the economy, like nature-based solutions, even implicit within those, there's always like a sacrifice zone. Is it okay to destroy the caribou herd here because there's another one over here? Like, people are kind of deciding these kind of things, and it's problematic. So even when I see green in front of things, I get a little bit nervous about that. So COVID-19. So interestingly, so on Earth Day, on April 22nd, I was on a panel and we were talking to youth and around the city of Toronto, and they said, well, we're in the midst of this pandemic. The city was in a lockdown, and, you know, and rightly so, the young people are asking, what was the cause of this, right? I know at the time I just said, probably climate change and the way humans relate to nature. Then this report comes out from the United Nations in July of 2020, and basically says these kind of diseases have been on the rise, and they have to do with the degradation of the natural world, like basically humans' kind of relationship they have with the natural world, unsustainable resource activity, and climate change. And so those actually are the causes of why some of us are at work and some of us are in our houses and trying to find a quiet place to be able to do our work. So it's kind of interesting when I think about how folks are approaching the recovery, the economic recovery from COVID-19, that they're not focused, but I mean by the dominant nation states, they're not focused on the resource extraction. They're actually trying to accelerate it in order to recover from COVID-19 without realizing that's part of the underlying cause for why we're in the situation in the first place, and also climate change. So, I mean, their solution to this was the One Health approach, as opposed to the track that we're on. Like we see in Canada, particularly in Ontario, is really like upping the resource extraction as a way to recover from COVID-19, even though we know that that's part of the root cause of the problem in the first place. So this is kind of, I don't know, to me, it's very illogical to think that way. So I'm not going to read all this text, but here I just wanted to point out that colonialism is very much a part of extractivism. And these are just quotes from different Indigenous declarations. So one of the things that I do in my work is, you have to be very careful as an Indigenous person, that you're not representing everybody's views. I can speak to my experience, my research in Canada and with others. So where I look to sort of get a sense of what is kind of a collective headspace, what are the kind of experiences around the world. So I look to the international Indigenous environmental or climate change or water declarations, of which there's a number. And usually they originate because there's some big, huge meeting happening and Indigenous peoples don't get to participate in the way that they would like or in a meaningful way. So they have their own meetings and they produce these declarations and sometimes action plans. But you can see that as far as I could tell, in every single one of them, colonialism is acknowledged there. And this might be obvious to everyone who's listening and to the discussants, but it's not obvious, I find, to the nation states. They don't like to go there. Like they don't like, I sit on, you know, a climate change panel. I go to a lot of meetings and I'm in these spaces and I talk about colonialism and people just sometimes they completely ignore me and they're like, what does that have to do with anything? So they don't like, so I feel I always have to say it because I'm always trying to say it matters. And if you do not consider the role of historical colonialism, settler colonialism, ongoing colonialism, then you're going to recolonize through your solution to whatever it is that we're facing. And so a lot of the times in my work, I find people don't want to hear it. They don't want to, and it's been around a really long time. They don't see how it's related to these kind of issues. In Canada, two major reports came out. One of them was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in addition to colonialism in Canada, there's this broader context. So when I talk about this in the circles that I'm in, trying to offer Indigenous perspective, I try to say, well, there's a context for this too. The context is, in a Canadian context and other places around the world, there was explicit policies of genocide toward Indigenous people. So here we are trying to address the multiple crises we're facing, this huge climate crisis that everybody is facing, but maybe don't acknowledge that's what's going on. But in Canada, it was also cultural genocide. And so here I'm just reflecting on the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which people can easily find, it's online, that basically said that the Canadian state was trying to eradicate Indigenous peoples through cultural genocide. A lot of those processes also still exist. Recently, in 2019, the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry that also that specifically pointed to the targeting of women in a lot of this. So again, so a lot of my research gets oriented towards gender also being an issue in all of this as well. So again, this is a larger context. What was interesting about this report, more so than the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which laid out a number of recommendations, was they explicitly pointed to the extractive industry and the man camps as being a major issue in terms of the violence and murder of Indigenous women and girls and other genders. So they were more explicit in identifying those kind of links. So this is sort of the context that we're trying to do this work in Canada, and I'm sure it's like this in other parts of the world. So essentially, the context for climate justice in Canada that nobody really wants to hear about or acknowledge is that a lot of this cultural genocide existed because of trying to gain control over Indigenous peoples' lands and resources. So a lot of people would argue that still continues. That objective is still there, I would argue. So here I'm just pointing to the fact, and again, most people here would, they would be familiar with this, is the Mandela-Young Declaration, so of Indigenous women focused on climate change. So again, here they're just again pointing to what they see as being the problem. And I'm at, like a lot of people participating in this conference and that are listening, this would be similar. So again, identifying patriarchy and consumerism, like incessant profit making. So these have caused climate change. So to me, they also, what I find interesting about these declarations is that they identify what people talk about, what their experience is. They identify what the problems are, including critiquing what the states are imagining the solutions are, And also, but they still offer what they think could be happening. So I find them very useful in terms of like the diagnosis of what the problems are. So this is where colonialism is climate injustice. Here I rely a lot of the work of Kyle White, who's a Potawatomi scholar now he was at Michigan State, now he's at the University of Michigan. So what he talks about is, he identifies what settler colonialism is, and he clearly identifies this as being part of why Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities experience climate injustice. So people who don't cause the problem are the ones who experience the problems the worst. They're the ones who are the most at risk, the ones who are the most vulnerable. And colonialism is a big part of why that happens. And again, the Mandela Declaration also points to the same issues. This is also in the introductory remarks by Purjo, talking about the undermining of traditional livelihoods. So it's not just what I find in the Indigenous climate change research is that they tend to focus on, like they might focus on something very specific. Let's talk about people's individual, like my health as an individual and the impact I might have because of wildfires and respiratory disease. But they don't really like to talk about how we might have to modify. The solutions might be, okay, how can we modify people's living conditions so that, you know, they can adapt to climate change. So maybe there needs to be more air conditioning so people aren't experiencing heat stress. So they don't think about, like, no, we're actually talking about a whole society here. We're actually talking about people's whole way of life, and that affects everything, their laws, their governance, their sovereignty. I find they don't want to go there. And that, again, was another recent experience. I was asked to review this contribution on health in Canada on individuals, and they knew they needed to have a specific acknowledgement of Indigenous people. So of course it's an afterthought, and that's how they were doing it. It was driving me crazy because I couldn't explain it to them, just saying, we're not just talking about, oh, someone's going to experience heat stress, and because Indigenous peoples in Canada have poorer outcomes in terms of health than just about every health indicator you can think of in relation to the non-Indigenous population. I go, we're not just talking about these indicators of health, we're talking about someone's whole way of life and the future generations. And they don't, partly because I don't think they have methodologies for how to figure that out. But so the way that people think about this is, I think, flawed. I'm not saying it's all wrong. I'm not going to throw out the window and say, no, we shouldn't be thinking about health, heat stress and respiratory. And so the health issues that are identified tend to be things that people can measure. So there's a huge bias towards, if you can measure it, then it exists. If you don't, then it doesn't, right? So that's why I had this year, I go, well, how are they going to do that? And because they can't do it, they don't acknowledge it. We're talking about whole societies and people's way of life. So anyway, that's my little rant on that. I will just say that I'm in so many circles where I say a lot of this kind of stuff and people just go, we don't see how that's relevant. But probably all of you see how it's relevant because you're in that kind of headspace for this. So some of the assumptions, a lot of the work is Indigenous societies are going to be more vulnerable because, in large part to these ongoing colonial forces. They haven't gone away, they're still there. But Indigenous societies have also adapted and survived, which I think other people can learn from. So again, this is drawing on Kyle's White. I'm not going to read it all, but what he's saying is, Indigenous peoples experience climate change as an intensification of environmental change imposed by colonialism. That's how people experience it. And that's in the research that I do, community-based research that I could do, that's how people talk about it. Like on the ground, in a meeting with, you know, people who hunt and trap, that's what they say. They say, yeah, well, the climate change, what we're seeing looks a lot like the environmental change that we saw through either clear cutting or being forced relocation. Like, so they see that without, like, you know, reading all the academic literature, right, or the international declaration. So that's how people experience climate change. But people have also figured out how to have also adapted as well. I'm not used to, I'm not teaching this term, so I'm not used to talking this long, so I do have to take a little break, and everyone could take a break at the same time and get a drink of water. So the other interesting thing that Kyle White says, and I'm saying déjà vu because it's his terminology. So a lot of what people are experiencing, and actually what you see in some of the Indigenous scholars writing around climate change is, you know, we've already had to face our dystopia, because that was all the rage for a while, young people and reading dystopia novels. And we already had to face our apocalypse, and a lot of this again caused by these external factors, and for us well over 500 years. But we've also figured out how to survive through these things. But the other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of how Indigenous peoples understand and experience climate change is a lot of how we think in terms of our worldview and ontology is always everything goes beyond the human dimension. So we're not just thinking about what's the impact on people, we're also thinking about what's the impact on our relatives, our teachers, which are the plants and animals and birds, because in Anishinaabe worldview, they're persons. So it's not just only about us, it's about these other entities and beings as well. So I've said some of this already. Especially for many people in the north, will be impacted faster, more violently than others. Like it's happening, like in Canada, it's happening rapidly, but in the north, far more rapidly. And because of that, it's making people a lot more vulnerable to the extractive industry. So for example, there's a lot of people who are pretty happy that, you know, the ice is melting in the north, because then they're thinking, oh, how can we exploit the fisheries stock there now, right? So I'm like, oh no, that just extends this kind of mentality to places that were at one time not considered to be viable to do these kind of things, right? Also, Indigenous peoples are impacted differently, holistically. And again, some things that can't be necessarily measured, like people's well-being. I thought I would put this in. This is the work of Laurie Lambert, who writes a book on Indigenous research for survival, and this is really also coming out of the narrative with the conflict between the commercial fishers and the Mi'kmaq on the east coast of Canada at this moment, is that we're not just talking about things that are happening to the land that then just impact people. You have to think about the land itself as experiencing the trauma as well. So in Indigenous efforts to move forward or think about a future, you're also thinking about how are you going to acknowledge this, and how are you actually going to try to heal the land and the waters that's considered to be. And this kind of makes sense when you think about Indigenous ontology of when people say, and a lot of these declarations that I talked about, people will often start off by saying, we are the land and the land is us. Okay, what does that actually mean in terms of how we diagnose, understand, and move towards solutions? So I really like this work by Laurie Lambert and how she talked about that. She's actually a behavioral psychologist, so she says we actually can't help people unless we also help the land. So again, Indigenous peoples have resisted. So what I will say, so a lot of the research that I do, so I'm shifting gears a little bit here, is what is it about Indigenous peoples that have enabled them to survive through all of this? Like I always say, what everybody else is now facing, we've already faced. We already had to face our annihilation. We already had to face like people basically trying to eradicate you and everything about who you are. But here we are, and part of the work that myself and others are doing is looking at, okay, what were the laws and governance and knowledge systems that enabled us to be able to do that? How were we able to transform? How are we able to enable sustainable relationships with all of creation? These existed for thousands and thousands of years in the context that I'm in. Anyway, if I were teaching in Toronto, it would have been multiple nations. So there's multiple knowledge. There's all this knowledge that exists that helps people to helps people to adapt and survive and be resilient. So we've always been here, and not only like this knowledge that people have, but knowledge within the land itself. Again, these are just other declarations. This is like, again, where people these are Indigenous women's declarations, are again speaking to obligations and responsibilities to be able to take care of the earth. And this is where it kind of goes beyond, let's say, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because that's very focused on rights, and rightly so. But also Indigenous peoples also speak to responsibilities to natural world. And with the Beijing Declaration, here they talk about natural laws. That's often how you'll see it mentioned, is natural laws, where people start to talk about what are Indigenous legal traditions, what those look like, what role do they have to play in all of this. And the work that I do, it's through, like, I didn't speak to this report, but there was another report done about 30 years ago in Canada called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. And this was a result of a big conflict. And the main finding from that report, after 6 years and millions of dollars and whatever else that they did for the commission, was that any government policy that was intended for Indigenous peoples was wrong. And I still see that as being the case, because they don't take into consideration that Indigenous peoples are societies, just like these people who have these individual things happen to them. And basically their solutions don't take into consideration like the real concerns and lives of Indigenous peoples. So what is it that enabled people to survive? And what it was our own knowledge. It was our own way of life, and it was our own laws and adhering to those, because it wasn't anybody else's solution. It was what we were determining for ourselves. So these were a lot of the traditional activities, if you're still able to do them, that would enable well-being in communities, and those build resilience. And this is in the work that I do with elders. That's actually what they said. That's what's enabled us to survive. It wasn't other people's solutions. And it was our own knowledge, our own lives, our own laws, and our own way of life that enable us to do that. And that will enable us to be resilient. So this is just pictures of my family, because where I am, we have what we call a sugar bush, where we tap trees and make maple syrup. And it isn't even just a matter of survival. We just don't want to survive. We actually want to flourish. We actually want to be well, right? So it also ensures well-being. And I should really look at the time to make sure I'm following the time properly.
You're good.
Okay, because I can get out of control here and talk about all kinds of things. Okay. I think I talked about that. Decolonize climate change. Again, climate change is gendered, and a lot of the laws and policies and practices, like I said, came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, support a historical and ongoing colonial agenda. It's still very much, and right now with COVID-19 and people trying to recover, that's intensified actually. And in states in Canada, the provinces, because they have a lot of the jurisdiction over lands and resources, really upping the ante in terms of resource exploitation as a way to try to stimulate and recover the economy. I just wanted to talk a little bit about a workshop that I did with youth and elders. It was November of 2017, and I was asked to facilitate this gathering. Youth, and it was actually organized by youth in Ontario, and they wanted to talk about climate change, and they wanted to engage and talk to elders and learn about what they had to say about climate change and the environmental experiences that they had throughout their lives. And what was interesting about it was often, and I'm not saying it's not true, there's often these perceptions that there's major generational gaps, which is true, but it was also surprising that a lot of them agreed on some things. Like they had common ideas about what needed to be done. when they talked about their own experiences, they talked about how the importance of the land, like that was still really key to adaptation and resilience and a future. Elders talked about how there was like a need to really engage with youth so they could learn language, and they could learn, because that also helps to build resilience and the traditions and being on the land. What was really, and this was where I felt like I was in, sometimes I felt like I was in the Matrix, you know, like that movie where there's these alternative realities. So this workshop was actually funded by Environment and Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which doesn't exist anymore in Ontario because the different government came in and they, you know, have some denial of climate change kind of issues. So that actual ministry doesn't exist anymore, but it did in 2017. And so they come to the workshop, and they're presenting what their solutions are to what they see as being Indigenous, their solutions to, you know, the situation, the climate change situation that communities are experiencing. And so they tend to take what I call a program approach to it. So what they were trying to really push on people was, okay, do you want a community garden? So a lot of one of the themes that came up here was food sovereignty, food security. We want to be able to hunt. We want to be able to go gather our medicines. We want to be able to you know, get berries. We want to be able to fish. But all these resource extractive industries are preventing that because they contaminate the water. The moose aren't, we can't find them anymore. The moose population is declining. And so they're pointing to these broader issues, or the problem with that become a constraint in terms of being able to adapt or even mitigate climate change in their communities. And the solutions from the government folk were, well, maybe you can have a community garden or a greenhouse. We have funding for that. And then the people again would say, actually, no, we want to be able to go on the land and take youth on the land, and we want to be able to trap. And there was this conversation going back and forth like that. And I'm sitting there going, this is like so surreal, like in the same room talking about what the approach that needed to take in order for there to be Indigenous climate justice. And it was just falling on deaf ears. And it was like, no, what you need is a community garden. That's going to solve food sovereignty. And I'm not saying people don't, like, that's a bad idea, but that was not the scope. That's not what people were saying. Staying in their communities. That's not me, is it? No. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that sometimes, like, even when you are in the same space, like the dialogue is not happening. Like, it's just like totally at cross purposes. I remember sitting there going, oh my goodness, like this is, and you can scale this up to like every level, that kind of experience. What was interesting about this is when the youth started to imagine their future, and we used different, well, actually they did a lot of design. My job was just to facilitate, you know, and help people do what they needed to do, was in terms of imagining and trying to self-determine what a future might look like. And I like this image because it says, love Earth. And that conversation never happens in any of the other circles that I'm ever in. Only ever in Indigenous circles do people talk about love as being part of a climate change dialogue. I had students go through all the IPCC reports and the Canadian assessment reports, and it doesn't come up anywhere. But in almost every Indigenous climate change meeting that I've been in, that's what people talk about, is love for future generations and love for the Earth itself. So there's a different narrative in an Indigenous context. So just some of the insights here, some of the elder insights. So what was interesting is elders talked about their focus was healing of the Earth, and the youth is being able to connect again with the Earth. And again, they're critiquing the industry. That being a major issue with being able to adapt so just coming in at the community level and throwing some program funding at communities isn't going to address the climate change issue at all, right? It's not going to address the climate justice issue at all the way that they're describing it. And importance of Indigenous knowledge and also Indigenous language. And actually, I just recently submitted a grant to look at climate change and language, Indigenous languages, as how revitalization of languages can also be a form of resilience. We'll see if people agree with that. But again, that came from on the ground work that I was doing with elders and youth, that's an important thing to be happening, even if the academic literature hasn't caught up with that. And again, here people are talking about the legislation, that basically other people's laws and legislation aren't solving this. And they need to draw on from our own laws, what people generally call natural law. So this always brings me to the conclusion that other people's solutions, these broader laws and governance systems, the solution doesn't really lie there. And I'm not going to say that's true for everybody, but consistently with Indigenous people, they're like, well, we have our own laws for dealing with this. We have our own ways of how we would have dealt with dramatic change. And I don't have time to get into it in this presentation, but one of the things I did was to look back at our own stories. And in our own stories, for Anishinaabe, we have had to face destruction before. And how did we deal with that? Like, how can I learn from our stories about how we would deal with these major destructive kind of forces coming into communities? So basically the current system is failing. And these are the reports that I began the presentation with are pointing that out. Like that's not top secret. So what are Indigenous laws? So some of the scholars in Canada, John Burroughs, M.A. Craft, talk about Indigenous laws, Indigenous legal orders as being very much about responsibilities, which were consistent in some of those broader declarations that I pointed to earlier. So these are just some of the major I guess, principles that come from Indigenous law and Indigenous legal orders from work that's happening in Canada. And it's very much in it's still emerging. It's like we're still trying to figure out, okay, how are we gonna enter this into the broader dialogues around climate change? But to me, it's very key to trying to decolonize it. We have this concept of Namadzuin, which basically means living a good life. So for Anishinaabe, that's the ideal that we strive for. And this state of well-being or this good life doesn't just mean for us, for people. It means for all our relations. It's not possible to live well or be well unless all our relations are well. Again, yeah, this is again another some pictures from the workshop. So instead of always, and often Indigenous peoples are in this position, we're always having to react to all these crazy things that are happening in your territories and in your lives that affects your whole society, because they are societies. And that sometimes it's hard to kind of wade through that and think about, well, what do I want? What do I want for my future? What is my self-determined future going to look like? And to determine what our own solutions are, because other people's solutions, they're not great, or I guess maybe what I should say is they're limited. They're limited because they have limited basic understanding of Indigenous peoples. And because I think, as I pointed out at this workshop, if governments actually enacted on what Indigenous people solutions would be, like that would completely change the resource development type of activities that would be taking place, right? So they're obviously not prepared to do that. Earth, language, and identity was identified as being really important. Those need to be supported. You know, climate change adaptation plans, again, programs for that need to support these kind of activities, things that people don't think as being like climate change solutions. I call it usually the big C word, carbon, which is true, but it's not the only thing. Decolonizing the laws and policies. Part of doing that is engaging Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way, at all scales and levels. Not after the fact, which tends to happen a lot. I find it happens to me a lot, where I'm the afterthought. Oh, I think we need an Indigenous perspective, so let's throw, like, what do you think? Like, write a little few sentences here. And I'm like, no, that's not how it should be happening. Engaging with Indigenous knowledge systems. That tends to be extracted in processes as opposed to knowledge sharing. Climate change not to be compartmentalized, because in Canada, and I've seen this actually in literature, so it tends to be climate change monitoring is a separate thing. You'll see a bunch of literature on that. Then you have climate mitigation, but not so much on that anymore, because I think a lot of folks have thrown in the towel on that. Then you have climate change adaptation, and then you have climate change, resilience, they're all like separate, like they don't see them holistically and together in the way that people actually experience this in their lived reality, right? Gender is an issue as well. Women experience, and other genders, non-binary genders as well. And there needs to be a recovery of the traditional systems and decolonization. So Indigenous futures is, I think it's, people do still see a future. And again, this is where I really think, and some of my work is leading towards looking at some of our stories and how did we adapt to disasters in our history? Because it's thousands and thousands of years, right? And I don't want to romanticize this and say we were perfect. We weren't. We were not perfect. We had to deal with stuff. But the difference was we had our own ways of figuring that out. We had our own laws and governance, and we could fix our own mistakes. And now other people sort of decide what the solution should be for Indigenous peoples, and it hasn't really worked out all that well. I just wanted to point to the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, because I think there is a shift in how people are thinking that that the Earth is alive and having agency. And these are just a couple of I really like the declaration. But these are just some things that jumped at me. Again, this idea of responsibilities. What are our responsibilities to the Earth? Not just rights to it to be able to exploit. And then passing on the future generations, not only values and traditions, but institutions. Again, broader than just like the individual kind of indicators that I find a lot of the climate change work tends to focus on. And again, I'm not saying that's not important. It's just not holistic, and it doesn't really kind of deal with like a way of life or a society. And that's it. So miigwech. So thank you for that. Yeah, hopefully that kind of made sense, and you enjoyed that to some extent. And yeah, I look forward to having a conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Deborah. That was really insightful for us, that you were addressing these relational and holistic views and how Indigenous peoples are reclaiming their futures, but also their presents and pasts. That was wonderful. Now I would like to give the floor for Hanna Kuttor. So for all the listeners here, some information how we're doing this. This is going to be more interactive from here on. So we have 3 sets of invited comments, and then we open the floor for Q&A. And there are already a few questions in the chat, so we will take them after Hanna, Eija, and Paula. Hanna, go ahead.
Thank you. Puore päivi pohkaide saamekielait vahkoja saamekielait. What? Kuuluukaan? Do you hear me? Yes.
Kuuluu. Ipimalaatti.
Yes. Saamekielait vahkoja saamekielait kulma tihtemaid mun hallitan puolestahti talkus saamekilliin. Because of the week of Sami languages and the need of indigenous languages to be heard in these kinds of seminars, also I start by wishing you all a happy afternoon in Northern Sami. So puore päivi pohkaide. So thank you, Deborah, very much for an inspiring talk. You have touched many themes, and I don't have possibility to touch them all. But also then the cases are a little bit different all over the world in different indigenous societies. But you are really right that climate change and the search for alternatives truly is the most emergent and most demanding task in our time. And I have the pleasure to share some thoughts, not as a comment, but more as a thinking with in regard to my autoethnographic research as a Sami, who not as a child learned the connection to the land, nor the language of her father, but who then later I have revitalized, or I am still in a process of revitalizing them both, the connection to the land and the language. Currently I work as a senior researcher, like Pirjo already mentioned. And like you write in many places, humanity is not alone going to possess the solutions required for climate change. yes, non-human actors do their part. Earth and the smaller entities of the planet are all the time searching for a balance in a constant change. If this system in which we now live in, if this system is not working, there will come a new system. Glaciers and icebergs melt and the temperature on Earth rises until there is a balance again. Whether that balance includes human beings or not, that is it, what makes us humans to search for solutions. Search for solutions of having us included in the future of the Earth. And still we are living in the middle of, like you mentioned, like or from Kyle White, in the middle of an intensification of colonialism and extractivism, capitalism and capitalocentrism. Indigenous lands, lifestyles and ontologies have been colonized in the project of modernity. And for example, the lands of Sami people are all the time threatened by mining companies and now also, for example, by Arctic Railway. But what I keep a little bit on struggling with is how we openly and honestly face the problem that also some indigenous communities or societies or peoples have been changing themselves with the capitalist transformation. So extractivist practices and policies have made their way into at least some indigenous societies, or at least our generations, in multiple ways. Our minds have been colonized. So what could then be the affirmative way to produce this critique? You were presenting wonderful examples from those workshops, but how about to have those workshops also with others than only these indigenous peoples, maybe, and many people we are also doing that. But what could be the affirmative way to produce this critique on extractivist policies and over again colonizing practices, especially for us who are living in between indigenous and non-indigenous worlds, or in both? Could we tell more about that, how extractivism and over-capitalist welfare have made us enjoy the fruits of it, but maybe still left us empty? I sometimes feel that the discussions tend to be a little bit too much in a kind of dichotomic. And indigeneity does not make us always pure. So how could we tell more diffractive stories, maybe even confessional? Could we that way invite others to join into this major transformation by recognizing in ourselves how we have also lived in this extractivist world and in this capitalist world, and how we, like you also mentioned, that it's connected to everything, that how we through small steps start to create different ways of life in very practical issues also. And then also when I was listening to your talk, then I started again to think about creator, that in Europe, we are actually not very much talking about creator. So we start to recognize the creator also in Europe, and in addition to love, bring also creator in our academic discussions, question mark. And yeah, I have also been very inspired by Sean Wilson's thought that he sees neoliberalism as an overgenerational trauma of losing the connection to and with the land. We have built up a system of welfare and progress in which we have got lost or sick. That's the word Isabella Stingers uses. We have forgotten our dependence, our connectedness, our relationality, our belonging to and with the earth. Who is this we, you might ask? I think John Mohawk, a late Seneca Indian thinker, partly answers this when he speaks about re-indigenization. quote, when I talk about re-indigenization, when we talk about re-indigenization, we need a much larger, bigger umbrella to understand it. It's not necessarily about the indigenous people of a specific place. It's about re-indigenizing the peoples of the planet to the planet. It's about us looking at the whole thing in the broadest of possible ways. And in the end, maybe a very, very careful question to the end, which came to my mind yesterday when I was listening a book launch of Leah David's The Past Can't Heal Us, The Dangers of Mandating Memory in the Name of Human Rights. So I was thinking, how do we not end in human rights fights between different ethnicities or nationalities, but recognize the Mother Earth as mother for us all? Like I think it was Sophia something, I didn't remember the right up the surname, and I didn't find the name in the program, but yesterday in People's Sovereignty Network session, Sophia mentioned that mother is mother for all of us. So how do we not make our common struggle for retransforming climate to that kind of climate where we also survive? How do we not make that fight to a fight of human rights between, for example, indigenous and non-indigenous? We are all in this together. For example, like reproductive rights. We have to protect the indigenous lands, and we have to protect the non-indigenous lands. And the difficult questions could be, for example, where can we build the minds we need for our mobiles and laptops, for example? This is a tricky world. We do have much to learn from our elders and much to think with them and with these tricky questions. But thank you, Deborah. Actually, there were many questions, but there was also not only one question which I would ask, wait you to answer, but some thoughts. Thank you.
Kiitos Olu, Hanna. So, Deborah, we would like to hear your reflections.
I just thought it was awesome. I think, yeah, there's a lot to say there. I guess things that were sticking out in my mind were even the way that we kind of think about things, like the book that you cited. We're not going to learn from the past. I sometimes I think people are way too linear in how they think, as opposed to things kind of happen. It's like I was referring to some of the stories that I'm sort of turning to learn from, because I keep reading all the brother narrative and I'm not terribly inspired by that. I'm like, okay, and we weren't perfect. Like I always say that Anishinaabe, I won't speak for other Indigenous people, we weren't perfect, we made mistakes. And in our stories, we talk about, I call it a climate change story, the pipe into eagle story, where people messed up royally, even though we were told how to behave properly. And usually when the destruction happens is because people were not behaving properly. Everything else was fulfilling their obligations and responsibilities, and creation as a verb. And people messed up through vanity, greed, all these kind of things that people are prone to because we're gifted with will and intelligence. And in that story, it's actually the animals that petition on our behalf for destruction not to happen. But they have to find people who are living properly with the natural world, like with all of creation. And the people has 4 days to do that, and find some people doing it. Who does find people who are respectful and not taking more than they need, and but the eagle does it out of love for future generations. Even if our generation is like not behaving properly, what about future generations? So again, love is really central in that story. And I don't remember it was in the paper that I gave you, but in a lot of our stories, it's usually the non-humans who bail us out, because even though we're incredibly smart, like humans are intelligent, we're also prone to being destructive about that intelligence. But we can also be very beautiful and creative and innovative in terms of how we want to be in the world. So that's also part of the stories too. So the stories never present us as being perfect. right? So that's why I look to them. Okay, we're definitely not perfect now. Like, what are these things that are happening, and what is it that we can learn about? Everything's about how we're going to conduct ourselves properly with each other, and in the world, with the ancestors and with future generations. I do think, like, when I think about community, so in Canada, the process is such that, and it's not regulated, it's not part of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act or anything like that, where they're trying to sort out impacts, what's going to be the impact on Indigenous peoples or anybody else when a project is going to go forward. Is one of the ways to gain compliance. I'll say it that way. I'm pretty sure a lot of the impact benefit scholars would completely disagree with me. Not like that word. To agree to a project is through impact benefit agreements, or those kind of agreements, right? Like, how there's going to be this impact, how are you going to benefit? Those don't go under public scrutiny because they're specifically with the individual Indigenous nation group and the company. So those are private, so they're outside of the regulatory framework, right? And so communities will agree to them. Not everyone in the community, often it causes huge division at the community level, right? Will agree to these. And again, that's very much linked to colonial process, because in Canada, that's the Indian Act, like that's the Chief and Council. They have the official leadership. So they can sign on to it, even though 90% of the community doesn't like it, right? But there was a young woman named Courtney Arsenault, who did research in one of the big areas in Ontario that's controversial, what we call the Ring of Fire. And she found that, and that's what she was asking this question, like, why would you sign on to these, like, considering tradition, values, and everything else? And a lot of the times it's because basic human rights are not being met. People don't have clean drinking water. People don't have housing. People don't have, so they see these as one strategy to have those kind of basic human rights met. They're not like selling out on their culture. They're trying to make sure people have clean drinking water in the communities. And this, so to me, it's still very much a problem of the state in that situation, because they're supposed to be providing this to people and they're not. So these communities are desperate, often facing multiple crises, and they're seeing those as a strategy to try to, that's not for all of them, but I did find her research interesting in that respect, that it's really complicated and it's really messy. But the way it gets presented in the media, it's sort of like that's not how it gets presented, right? And linking it to it's actually legal, the Indian Act, it's a law that creates this situation where these people can make these kind of decisions, even though the rest of the community may not agree, right? So yeah, so to me, it's, I think about that as, yeah, I think about it being as very messy, and like even in my own community, there's a lot of things I don't agree with. But at the same time, there, like, it seems to be this constant negotiation and tension that's existing in communities. And I think in some cases, we just don't want to air that out there. And what you always see is a binary. Like the binary is sort of like the default way of thinking about these kind of things, right? So, or very linear kind of thinking. And to me, those, because you do epistemology and ontology, you kind of have to unpack those too. Like there's always a binary, it's always linear. It's like, no, it's not actually. It's a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. And we don't often kind of get those stories. So hopefully that's some kind of response. But one of the things I took this slide out, but I really like this way of thinking about this, like with the Indigenous, non-Indigenous, even that's a binary. Like it's way more complicated. My name's McGregor. I have Scottish ancestors. It's not like, you know, is this artist and activist Isaac Murdoch Day, and he I remember, like, you know, going to his workshops and teachings, and he would always say, we're in this sacred story. Like what's unfolding before us now is a sacred story of the earth. And everyone has a role to play in that. And we decide who we're going to be. It's actually a choice. We decide if we're going to be the villain. We decide if we're going to be the hero. We decide if we're going to help, if we're not going to help. So he says, we're all in this. We're all in this huge sacred story that's unfolding before us. And we decide who we're going to be in that. And as humans, we have this incredible ability to be destructive or hugely creative and life-giving. And we're constantly often negotiating that. So hopefully that somehow shed some kind of insights into what you were saying. So thank you for that. It's really thoughtful. I enjoyed what you had to say about that.
Okay, then maybe we move to Eija Ranta's comments. Eija, please.
Thank you, Pirjo. And thanks so much, Deborah, for your fabulous presentation. It's really lovely that you are here with us today in this symposium on extractivisms and alternatives. It's really great to learn from your vast knowledge and experiences on Indigenous environmental justice, Indigenous well-being, and Indigenous perceptions of climate change. I really liked it how you started your speech with the notion of hope and with the notion of visions for future. I think that is what our whole symposium is about. It's about extractivisms, but also about alternatives, and we need those, and about the ways in which we could regain that hope that some sort of alternatives exist. So I really like that starting point. I believe your key message was that self-determined solutions are needed. However, I still wanted to ask your views about the role of agents of coloniality, like the nation state or political parties, in Indigenous future imaginations. And why I'm asking this is because I want to reflect upon some experiences from Latin America. I read some of your articles in which you talk about this concept of Mminamotjavin, which is really, really inspiring and brilliant articles. Your analysis of Mminamotjavin sounds really similar to how Indigenous activists in some Latin American countries like Bolivia or Ecuador defined Sumakkamania, Sumakkausai, Nyandereko, or some other Indigenous worldviews or Indigenous philosophies or paradigms at the early stages of left-wing governments during the last 15 years or so. I have been conducting some research on how Indigenous conceptualizations of living well among Bolivia's many Indigenous peoples were introduced to state policy and to bureaucratic practices as vivir bien, and how the initial meanings were drastically changed over time through state co-option, ending up, just to name one example, in legitimizing oil and gas extraction in some Indigenous communities and lands in the Amazonas. So consequently, I was wondering if I could ask about your reflections on state co-option of Indigenous alternatives, either in Canada or elsewhere in the world. And maybe relatedly, if we think of concrete, like mainstream political alternatives amidst the hegemonic colonial political system, like social democracy or liberalism, socialism, and so on. So what are the stances of Indigenous activists and nations towards political parties as agents of change? And I'm asking this because of this, for example, socialist co-option of such notions as vivir bien or buen vivir in Latin America, and how they ended up having very different how indigenous conceptualizations ended up having very different kinds of meanings through this kind of other political ideologies. So maybe I end here. I have some other questions, and there are also really interesting questions in the chat. So I don't want to take too much of the time. So
yeah, please, Deborah. Thanks so much, Aya.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, too bad. I would have loved learning more about your research and work. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question. In terms of the state or other actors, they're not off the hook at all. Like, they have obligations and responsibilities, being responsible for colonization ongoing and otherwise, and all the other things that patriarchy. So, and I say that because there's different thinking in terms of this in Canada. People who don't have anything to do with the state, they don't have anything good to offer. I'm like, they're not off the hook. They like as I talked about earlier, they have obligations and responsibilities, and they're not off the hook. I guess as you were talking, what made me automatically think of is there's this very much an extractive mode. So people go into Indigenous lands and extract, but they also do the same thing with concepts. So that's major appropriation. They do the same thing. They do the same thing with Indigenous concepts as well. And so, for example, in Canada, like Indigenous knowledge, right? So that terminology has kind of changed. It's not actually an Indigenous term. People have their own words in their own languages for what we mean by, and it's usually a verb. Like, it's not. It's usually something that you do. It's knowing. And so, for example, in Canada, for a while, in the legislation, and this is because of Indigenous advocacy saying, look, like, your decisions aren't great. You should really be considering us in decision making and our knowledge. And so they go, okay. So then for a while you saw ATK, Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge. And people didn't like that because traditional just means in the past, but of course knowledge changes over time and it's relevant, and it was always like that. People weren't static for thousands of years. And Canada recently went through a environmental reform. We're looking at the legislation, like the environmental legislation. And Indigenous nations were really pushing for recognition of Indigenous laws, not just Indigenous knowledge. State wasn't really comfortable with that. And Indigenous knowledge systems, which is different. Indigenous knowledge systems speaks to the whole society, not just I have knowledge of this, but the whole system that supports knowledge. Like, we're all an academic institution, so we're all within the system that supports knowledge production in particular ways. Who's considered an expert? What support did they get? And everything else. So Indigenous peoples have their own systems. And surprisingly, in the early sort of stages, when the expert panel reports came out, they talked about Indigenous knowledge systems. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if they kind of know what that means. Like, if they're like, over time, it's not there anymore. And it's just Indigenous knowledge as a noun, this body of knowledge you can extract from people. So to me, the overriding paradigm for dealing with anything Indigenous is still very extractive. Whether you're talking about concepts and knowledge, they haven't grappled with laws yet, like how that would be dealt with. So yeah, we do see, like, terminology. Canada has so many different languages that, people tend to kind of do Indigenous knowledge, and in other concepts as well. So because we try to take more of a strength-based approach, like, it's, a lot of bad things are happening, but there's also a lot of strength in communities as well. And I do work with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centers. So they serve urban populations, and we were doing work on, they got funding to do work on homeless people in an urban setting. And they turned it around and said, well, no, we actually want to understand what people's sense of home is, which is a completely different narrative. And surprisingly, that was not unsurprisingly from an Indigenous perspective, that was still tied to the land, that was still tied to identity, that was still tied to language. And then we did another one on, it was anti-poverty. And they said, well, let's turn that around and call it prosperity. What do people understand to be well-being and what does it mean to be prosperous as an Indigenous person. And again, a lot of that was tied to land, to identity, to language, traditional foods, that kind of thing. It wasn't monetary kind of stuff per se. And then I was doing this, Canada has this process that they draw on the World Health Organization where they measure well-being. And again, it's things that you can measure. And so the economic education, so they have these indicators. So they try to develop that for Indigenous peoples in Canada to try to measure that, but they were trying to indigenize it. So they were talking to a number of people, of which I was one of them, and their indicators were like awful. And I said, these are like not indicators of what you're trying to measure at all. They said, well, they all have to be things we can measure, otherwise we don't know. And I'm like, well, people can tell you. And one of them was prosperity, and I regretted saying it because they had this economic one, and I go, well, prosperity is understood differently. Like you're automatically assuming it means capitalist economic gain. And in the work I do with people, that is, like, as the previous question pointed out, there's those tensions exist, but really in a lot of the work I was doing, that wasn't how people were defining and understanding prosperity. But they took the term anyway, and I said, no, like, what I was saying was completely different than how you've presented this. And I sent them a note saying, you can't say you talked to me about this at all. I don't want to be associated with your well-being index because you appropriated this, which isn't even an Indigenous word, but they totally changed the meaning of what it meant to support their awful indicators. So no, it's a huge problem. And any concept like that, I'm finding in Indigenous languages, is never a standalone concept. There's always a context. And so as soon as, as soon as it's taken kind of out of its context and plopped into something else, it's plopped into this other legislation, then it's going to be serving somebody else's interests, because they were concepts that made sense in a society, a standalone, thousands of year old society that did constantly change and interact with other nations. Like we did interact with other nations. We do have ways of sharing knowledge, but respecting the integrity of that knowledge. So for us in the Great Lakes, we have an agreement with the Haudenosaunee. It's a treaty with them. It's not with the Crown. It's between ourselves and how we're going to, and we don't appropriate each other's concepts. We might share them. So I see that throughout my whole career. I've seen that with Indigenous law. As soon as it comes out of the Indigenous context, the society, because they don't want to recognize Indigenous peoples as a society. They just want to say, oh, there's these people, let's just plop this in there. And then it starts serving somebody else's interest. But they are definitely not off the hook. And Canada currently right now, the dominant narrative is this idea around reconciliation that came from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the state has a completely different idea about what that is than Indigenous peoples. It's because Indigenous peoples have always been the ones to have to reconcile all the time. And the state's not all that keen on doing their end of the reconciliation. So when I get this question about, well, what should the state be doing? I go, well, with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, there were 400 recommendations that came out of that. The Truth and Reconciliation, 92, murdered, missing, and Indigenous women and girls, probably well over 200, almost 300. I go, you've already been told. There's almost like 1,000 things you should be doing. That they've done all this work and studied this question, just do them. And maybe, like, they'll lead to more justice. Actually, the Murdered, Missing, Indigenous Women's National Inquiry, they called them calls to justice. They didn't mince words. They said, you need to do this in order to achieve justice. So they've been told what needs to be done, and they're not off the hook. So I guess I see part of my job is trying to hold them accountable in the different places and that I'm in, but at the same time, support what it is that communities want to do themselves, right? Because they can't count on the solution coming from there. They have to, draw a lot on their own strength to be able to do that. But at the same time, these other folks are definitely not off the hook and should be held accountable. So thank you for that. It's a good question.
Perfect. So now, Paula, now it's your turn, and this is the last set of the invited questions or comments. And then we will see the questions there that we have in the chat, and I'm sure there will be floor for other questions. So please, Paula.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this illuminating presentation. I really received a lot of inputs. For instance, with respect to the many indigenous environmental declarations and their zero visibility, I mean, worldwide, compared to those signed by the states. And this is also because of the narrative that is of the indigenous peoples as remote small communities living in isolation and not as part of a larger community embracing the whole planet, the Mother Earth. So it's important that we support the decolonization of international relations, and this is something that I really got from listening from your speech. And also, I mean, decolonizing the global environmental politics is very important. And as a political ecologist myself, as Pirio was introducing me as such, I also think that we must deepen political ecology that already looks at the history of the environment, I mean, as a area of study. And it looks also at the history of, I mean, at the reality of political economic structures. But we must, I mean, political ecology has to reconnect much more with the colonial past and also the colonial present. So besides that, I mean, your presentation was also inspiring for me since because it resonates a lot with the work that I'm doing actually in collaboration with colleagues in Ecuador. And it's on epistemic and territorial sovereignty and their articulations in education and the legal system. This is really also something that I would like to know more. And these two sectors are often kept apart, but they are so very closely connected and intertwined. So in Ecuador, the discourse of epistemological sovereignty as a basis for a decolonial project is very much debated since the 80s, late 80s, and by the organizations of the indigenous nationalities and peoples, which are quite powerful political actors in the country. And education is important for, I mean, for the strengthening revitalization of knowledge in their programs. So intercultural bilingual education, this is what they have formed, is together, I mean, with the government in, I mean, since the late 80s, and especially from the 90s. This was a program of education of the pluriverse in which many ontological and epistemological words coexist. And we know how educational policies provide a constructed meaning for other territorializing strategies. So they are so important also for this discussion on extractivism. As political construct, we know how schooling has in history been one of the main tools of nation state building as a tool and a tool for assimilation of ethnically diverse citizens. And actually the theme of education and power in Ecuador and Abya Yala has been addressed, Abya Yala, which is the Latin American and the Caribbeans, has been addressed within the decolonial thought of modernity and coloniality. And therefore, education knowledge and pedagogical designs are at the core of political debates of the relations between the indigenous organizations and the central state. The Marcha Histórica of 1992 marked an important turn for the sovereignty struggles of the indigenous peoples of Ecuador, because it succeeded getting a restitution of 1.5 million hectares of land. And in the new agreement, the indigenous organizations tried to include education as a strong political area that can enforce plurinationalism. And so this is about the coexistence of knowledges in line of buen vivir, not in the sense as appropriation that the government has done also in Ecuador, but the culture of life as an alternative to the principles of modernity and capitalist extractivism. And through the constitution of communities, and the schooling is also, I mean, how to say, a tool to agglutinate, to form relational communities that are I mean, connected to the Mother Earth through territorial systems. So it's understood as a relational practice in linking schools and communities, connecting youth with elders, connecting knowledge to nature, cultures, livelihoods, ecological practices, and territorial organizations. And it's interesting because what I've seen is an education that reflects embodied, sensory, spiritual, and also emotional understandings that constitute the formation of diverse eco-cultural identities. So the link with territoriality is fundamental, and there are different territorial units that are, have a different scale and so conceptualization. So starting from the Ayllu, which is the familiar places, to the Yakta, national places, Kauzak-Sacha, the living forest, and the Pachamama, the Mother Earth. So these are all learning environments that are lived within the community schools, but also, if we think at the Kauzak-Sacha and the Pachamama, they can also, constitute the basis for alliances. So it's like the national alliances of the nationalities, of the Ecuadorian people that have also struggled, for instance, against the extractivist projects of a government that sees the Amazonian region as a space of oil blocks and mines. So there is a subdivision of blocks given to the different corporations, and the Amazonia has been divided as such on the map. So the indigenous coalitions have been able to win some important struggles through court decisions supporting, like for instance, the one that is being quite famous over the Block 22 by the Waorani people, guided by the leadership, the leader Nemonte and Kimo. So community and place-based knowledge is a way to reverse environmental violence and territorial disruption, and as you were saying, and recognizing Kauzak-Sacha and Pachamama helps building alliances within the nationalities and also internationally. And so at the global level, looking at the Pachamama, and that's how I go back to the idea of the global social movements, territorial or not, indigenous or not, and on the opposite lines of the lived colonial experience. We should really try to innovate and decolonize international relations and the politics in order to reverse these current disruptive trends and support strengthen alternatives. So this is what I got as a reflection from your presentation.
Thank you so much, Paula. Deborah, please. Comparisons to Latin America.
Yeah, it was a lot there. Yeah, thank you for that. I guess when I think about like trying to decolonize like at these broader scales, like well, even at an institutional scale or at a smaller scale, I always think about, often the onus is always put on Indigenous people or marginalized people or women, whoever is being marginalized in some way. And I always kind of fantasize about there being like the powers that be sort of telling us how they're gonna unpack their power and let some of it go. I guess the reason I'm saying that is it's always like this onus and energy to have to enter into these spaces and carry all this extra burden to do all this work to try to decolonize others, when I think they should really be trying to take up a lot of that work themselves. Because as you know, all of us, likely people who are also participating in this panel, it's a lot of work and energy to do that. And one of the ways that I do suggest to people is look around and see who's like not there. Like not even like who's there, but like who's not here, who really should be here, that can begin to provide those decolonizing, or which is for everyone, and or indigenizing kind of voices in those kind of spaces. So that was sort of like one thought in some of what you were saying. But then I got really focused on the community-based land education component. I do agree that's key. Like I think a lot of the work that we need to do always has to be grounded somewhere. Like as scholars and academics, we can be very theoretical. Like we're over here, this should happen. But if you don't have that like grounded community-based kind of experience, it then becomes only theoretical instead of actually lived within people. Like you actually have people who know how to live the theories and concepts that we're talking about. Like that's kind of where it should come from. And I think the land-based community education can do that. And I will say that in Canada, there's kind of a move towards that. Like they're trying to do it as a way to decolonize. Even at the university level, they'll have these camps. Someone at the secondary school level, surprisingly, COVID has interrupted a lot of this in the public school system. Except in an Indigenous context where people went out on the land, because that's what we did last time when pandemics came, was just disperse and go out on the land, right? Like isolate in that way. But I think one of the tensions I'm grappling with there, and I guess probably it's why I kind of latched onto your comment in this way, because I actually somehow in the next couple of weeks I'm writing this paper with my son, and it's on exactly what you talked about. It's contributing to understanding what this land-based education can look like. And what I'm working on with him, because he works for this organization called Indigenous Sport and Wellness, and he developed this program called Standing Bear after talking to 500 youth. And he did this in North America. We have the North American Indigenous Games, where youth come and they participate in sport. And it was held in Toronto in 2017. They talked to over 500 youth there. What do you want? What does wellness mean? And again, identity, culture, language, land-based activities, didn't matter where they were from, which nations they were, that's what they said. And this was age like 11 to 19 is sort of what that, the Indigenous Games speaks to. And he had a lot of struggles with that program because the consultants, he just called them the white ladies. Maybe that's an awful thing to say, but that's like from his point of view, he's a youth, kept wanting to make things very linear, kept wanting to put everything in boxes. They didn't even like the concept of a bear, even though that came from youth, because bears are violent. And like he was dealing with all of this as a kid, and I'm trying to support him through this. You know, he's 20 years old, 21 years old, trying to take what these youth had told him and make it real in this program. But what the program does is it's a program that any youth anywhere can log on to, and they get accreditation in the Standing Bear program, and they do land-based activities, working with elders in the community, participating in learning a language, but it's outside an educational institution. It's not part of formal education, because one thing that the youth said is, we don't want it to be like school. We don't want it to be like that. We want it to be at our own pace and a range of activities, building upon our strengths and our experiences, actually counting for something. And but they keep trying to put it into schools all the time. So we're trying to write this piece that talks about what can that look like outside of those kind of very structured, kind of institutional kind of settings, which may not seem like that to us as educators, but from the youth perspective, that's what it looks like, right? So so I'm mentioning that because I'm still trying to sort out this ongoing tension, and that I think in some cases it absolutely has to be part of education and institutional, because people will not have the opportunity otherwise. It won't happen. It has to be there, and those kind of should be well funded, right? But then there's these other spaces where this happens outside of those kind of contexts, because a lot of youth don't want it to look too much like school, where they want to learn and get credit for their experiences and learning things from their own family members. Like you can learn like a lot of traditional activities from a lot of your own, and empowers the community in this way, because a lot of these people may have been disempowered to think that they have knowledge, but meanwhile youth are coming to them and saying, I actually want to know what it was like, you know, when there wasn't running water, where did you get water? You can learn all these kind of things. So I'll finish there, because I know there's a lot of other questions, but those were sort of the things that came to mind as you were talking. And I just happened to be trying to think through this community land-based education thing, and what is it like? How do you try to formulate this outside of the kind of places that we often find ourselves in because of who we are and the kind of work that we do. So, so thank you for that. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from all the discussants, from their research and work. So thank you for your commentary and taking the time to listen and respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring. I also have many questions I would like to pose on temporalities, on the use of concepts and so on, but let's go to the chat first, and then let's open it to the Q&A. Anybody can join this discussion, raise your hand, but we will go now according to the chat in a linear order. So there, in a chronological order. So there was a question by Barry Chills. Barry, could you ask, you wanted to ask more about, you wanted to know more about sacrifice zones and indigenous sovereignties.
Hi there. Well, two questions. That was what, how do you see the best ways, or what is needed to repair and heal sacrifice zones? And that includes the livelihoods and the life worlds of those zones and peoples. And the other one is, what role do you see for reclaiming indigenous sovereignty as a way to pursue the full recovery of indigenous life worlds and to realize full decolonization? Those are,
yeah, they're great questions, and they're huge, like probably whole courses. I think for the recovery of sacrifice zones, for some of them, that recovery isn't going to happen like in the people affected's lifetime, right? Like especially for uranium or even the tar sands. But I guess my default thinking on that is whatever the restoration or plans are for recovery, for lack of a better word, which can take, generations upon generations, should be Indigenous led. I think there's definitely a role for allies, for sure, but it really should be Indigenous led and should be the vision that communities actually want for that space, or that place, or that lands. But I think part of the challenge there is part of colonization in a Canadian context anyway, it's just really limited people's movement. So when you have a situation like what's happening in the tar sands, which is sickening, like destruction, like there's nothing alive there, is people would have been able to move. Like you would have been able to traditionally move from an area that wasn't going to support life anymore, or the continuance of life, so it could have a chance to recover, and you would go to another place. That's really constrained now through, let's say, Indian Act, where you're on the reserve and now you're surrounded by this situation. So that's so it really limits people's ability to be able to respond in the way that they would have. I mean, there wouldn't have been something like tar sands, but again, we have stories where there's a sickness in a place and people would like move from that place until, like actually Manitoulin Island, like where I'm from, the story is that for periods of time, people would move away from the island because it's really strong spiritually. And so it'd give it a chance to recover. So people would move away from Manitoulin Island, which is the biggest freshwater island, I guess, in the Great Lakes. And colonization happened there because colonizers showed up and said, oh, there's nobody here. And so but they didn't understand that people for periods of time would move from that place and then come back when it was ready to be able to support life and the community again. So people could move in a way that they can't, the way that they can't right now. And I think in a way that ties into your question around Indigenous sovereignties. So which was a reality for most Indigenous peoples for most of their history and existence, right? Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So when you're sovereign, and you can move from a place that's been destroyed basically because it's not going to support life anymore, and give it a chance to recover, is that you could form alliances because you could be moving into somebody else's territory. You would form those kind of treaties and alliances with people. When you're sovereign, you can do that, like with other indigenous nations. You don't need a state to approve that, right? So that to me becomes the real that becomes really important in terms of Indigenous sovereignties, is being able to do that, and why it's important. Because the state's not going to think about those kind of things. And Indigenous nations do that. Like there is a tribal First Nation accord for the Great Lakes. They're moving outside, like there's a historical treaties, like I mentioned before, let's say between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, because we were in conflict. We resolved that conflict, and it was over a lot of the times resources, for lack of a better word, and we figured that out. How are we going to share and how are we going to coexist? And move through these, and there had to be movement, because, you know, you needed to leave, you know, time for places to recover. But Indigenous sovereignties support that, and that's how it was. So now people are asserting that again, saying we don't need the state to work through. People, let's say in Southern Ontario, can't hunt, so they'll have their own agreements with nations in the north to be able to go into those territories and do the you know, and get their wild food. So I don't think Indigenous sovereignties are likely to be recognized by the state. They don't like to go there. In fact, very explicitly, and even in self-government policy, it says we do not recognize Indigenous sovereignty. But so Indigenous nations just have to assert that in the work that they're doing in order for it to be real. It already is a reality. It's just enacting it, and I think what a lot of Indigenous nations in Canada anyway, in doing that, they just want to say, this is what we're doing, we're sovereign, like you can take it or leave it, but we're going to kind of do it anyway. So that's sort of like my initial response to that, somehow tied in that way, that being able to deal with the sacrifice zone has everything to do with, you know, exercising and asserting Indigenous sovereignties. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. Christine, you have a question about language?
Yes. Hi, Deborah. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives with us today. I've learned a lot from your presentation. You briefly mentioned that language revitalization could be something used to increase Indigenous resilience. And I was wondering whether you made that statement specifically in the context of the climate crisis and how those two are related. And if there's time, I also have a question about, I'm currently working at the Arctic Center in Rovaniemi, Finland. And there's this idea of putting people first in the Arctic, which means that, which refers to the fact that climate or researchers have often imposed the prioritization of climate issues onto Indigenous peoples. Whereas Indigenous peoples themselves are often facing way more urgent issues. So there's this idea that climate issues are elitist in a way, and that this climate agenda is imposed on Indigenous peoples. And I was wondering whether you could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
Both great questions, and I was there last year because my former colleague Rona works there. She was from the University of Toronto. Yeah. So language was a bit of a connecting. The scholarship doesn't really deal with it that well. There's only one article that I could find written by that Nick Rio at Dartmouth did in the United States, Alaska. And it was more of a connecting the dots in terms of the literature, but it was coming from communities. Like they were saying, we need to build our resilience. The way that we always did it when we were facing whatever onslaught was coming was through our own language, which helps with identity, because so much knowledge and laws is contained within language. So that was always there in the Indigenous communities. Then because the International Year of Indigenous Languages, I believe, was 2019. There was a lot of literature coming out on Indigenous languages, and literally the survival of Indigenous people is tied to languages in a lot of these UNESCO kind of reports. In Canada, the declining of Indigenous languages, and a new act actually that came into force supporting in the First Nation Indigenous Languages Act in Canada, and also looking at the health research, because I happened to be sitting on a committee of a student at McGill looking at revitalization of Indigenous languages, and he was pointing to the literature that pointed to, because one of the crises in Indigenous communities in Canada anyway is I don't even like to talk about it, is the suicide crisis. And they found that if the youth were involved in language land-based activities, it decreased the incident of suicide, and that had to do with language. So I go, well, language must then build resilience, right? So I just kind of had to connect the dots that way, but it's already known in Indigenous communities. It's just not really known in the scholarly world that revitalization of Indigenous languages supports identity, supports resilience, like just builds the strength and ability in communities. People who are, when I speak to language speakers about this, they get it. It'll be more toward like others that I think it might be harder. Like I was at a big climate change gathering in Whitehorse in Canada, Assembly of First Nation put one on, and we were talking about language there. Like what is like everything's so sad. Climate change policy, Canada's like the Paris Accord, like Paris Agreement and state policy. And then they have all this other legislation that they don't see as being connected. So I said that First Nation Languages Act or Indigenous Languages Act is very much connected to climate change policy, and they don't see it. Or more recently now, the First Nations Family and Child Act, which deals with another crisis, which is children in the welfare system, right? So I go, that's still very much connected to the climate change agenda. So a lot of it is trying to draw these connections by approaching it in a holistic way than in a very siloed way. So a lot of it is trying to make those kind of connections, but it's hard to find that in the scholarly literature, partly because of our disciplines, we can be siloed. So this is a case where the academic world has to catch up to the lived reality. That's actually happening. To the second question, I can definitely see that. Like when and you have to be very careful also in thinking and writing about this too, is that Indigenous communities, or particularly First Nations in Canada, are dealing with multiple, what we are saying is multiple crises. So water crisis. The community just evacuated the last couple of days because they don't have clean water. A lot of boil water advisory, drinking water advisories in Canada. What I just talked about, welfare crisis, like literally there was more children in care than there ever were in residential schools. And this is related to broader things, right? Like poverty and housing. Housing crisis, you'll see people talk about now, infrastructure crisis, health. And so what climate change does is exacerbates all of those things. So when people are trying to figure out how 30 people can live in a 3-bedroom house in a remote community, probably, the Paris Agreement isn't the biggest thing on their minds, right? So some of it to some extent is, but then at the same time, what climate change does is it exacerbates all of that. It makes like the water situation worse. It puts more pressure on families and infrastructure because then money has to be diverted to different places than where it could be. And I think as you were talking, what it made me think of was the crisis, as it, like, not everyone thinks it's a crisis, right? It's still climate change. I'm in circles where they don't want to say crisis or injustice or justice. That has nowhere anything to do with climate, anything. Don't say those words. So is that it's, as I said before, like a lot of these Indigenous communities that are experiencing a lot of these hardships have been for some time, are still here despite genocidal policies, whereas the rest of the world is just now facing their annihilation. Like that's how they see it. That's what these reports say. If we do not change things, very bad things are going to happen. IPCC, IPBS reports, everything else, right? The COVID crisis. So now everybody else is facing what those communities face every day. So that's why it's such a big deal now. It's sort of like, oh my God, this is happening. And communities are like, yeah, it's been happening to us now for over 100 years. So yeah. So I can definitely see why that would be a criticism, because there's very much lived basic human rights not being met in a lot of communities. And yeah, so I don't know if that somehow answers your question. Those are just like sort of like my gut reactions to them. So thank you. They're good questions. And if you see Rona, tell her I say hi.
I will. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so let's have 2 more questions. So if you have short questions, and then we will have a floor for Deborah. Maria, please. You want to know more about methods, I see.
Was that my question? My question is actually, well, I think you have touched upon it a little bit, but just briefly, how do you see the role of non-Indigenous people in the struggles in Indigenous territories? So not of course blending in the community and the self-determination, but with the whole system in place, and also non-Indigenous researchers in supporting what you have put forward, which is fantastic here. But what is our role?
I think it's a really, really good question, and one I was thinking about recently, because it really depends, because I was on someone's PhD defense, maybe it was last Friday, yeah. And I think that Indigenous solutions should be Indigenous led, in my view, and there's so much work that needs to be done. There's a lot of space and a lot of room for people to support that, to be allies, although that sometimes that term kind of makes me nervous. A lot of people say I'm an ally, and I'm like, I don't know about that. You don't get to declare that, but yeah, so I think really trying to support Indigenous kind of led solutions, because a lot of communities I find are so disempowered that it's hard to, and you're dealing with so many things, it's hard to kind of sometimes, you know, see kind of the bigger picture there. Empower communities to be able to kind of tell their own stories, and to be able to like support and build that capacity within communities to be able to address the questions that they think are of utmost importance to them. I think there's a lot actually that non-Indigenous scholars and researchers can support, because they literally, like, really in the academy, even as a student, you have way more resources that any one of those communities have at our disposal. Like, we have ways to mobilize knowledge. We have privilege. Even me as an Indigenous scholar in a law school have a lot of privilege, and a lot of communities have. So how can we mobilize that to try to support what they would like to do? So sometimes it doesn't seem like it because we're told there's no money for that, but really we have a lot more resources at our disposal to enable the empowerment of communities to be able to engage in research. So a lot of it, in my view, should be collaborative. You know, that's probably, so it doesn't have to necessarily, because Indigenous peoples may not have the capacity to lead. That's why I'm saying, like, you have to kind of assess where communities are. Like some of them think, unfortunately, that other people still have to kind of solve these problems for them. Like a lot of people have, you know, like there's a lot of internal colonialism in a lot of communities. So it's like always thinking, how can I empower this community? How can we start building capacity? Because that then supports this other idea of Indigenous research, or research self-determination in communities. But I think the main thing that I would say there, because actually I teach a course in Indigenous research, and most people that I'm teaching are not Indigenous. And so your question is the question I get all the time. One is, always know what your motive is. Why do you want to do it? Is it just to advance my career, or is it actually to really help? Because they'll suss that out really quickly. And actually to figure out how you can mobilize and empower and build that capacity within communities to be able to determine their questions. And because some of the issues are so complex and so big, and something that at a community level could be related to something happening globally, that there's a huge role, in my opinion, for non-Indigenous researchers to be able to support those kind of situations. I think the other thing I'll add to that, because a comment that was made by one of the discussants is, if you're able to help Indigenous peoples in land protection and supporting livelihood, that's usually good for everybody else. It's like for the Dakota Access Pipeline issue in the US, protecting that water is good for like everybody there. Like, it's good for everybody, because we all need that, right? Like, everybody does. So it's not, yeah, seeing it that way as being supportive and having way more resources than any individual community has, that we have access to, can really help and empower them to be able to have their own voice, especially very marginalized people who even within a community may not necessarily have a voice in a lot of the work that we're doing. So it's a really good question, but not really enough time for me to. I'd like to be able to teach my whole course here, but no time.
Thank you so much. There is one question in the chat. This is the last one, and actually I was asked to read it. And maybe here I can put my own points, because I see that you started from IPES and you talked about the law systems of the dominant society, and you talked about indigenous laws. So we can really see that in the dominant societies' laws, there are really binary concepts. There are really much dualist categories, and indigenous laws, they are built from different systems. But at the same time, we can see that there are some advancements that are trying to bridge different knowledge systems, like the debates on biocultural rights has shown, and also the way how IPES has been creating its indicators. And here in the chat, there's a question like, how do you see a network like this, EXALT, can be a mean to facilitate other knowledge systems and practices, prioritizing the principles like living a good life?
It's a good question. And I think to some extent this EXALT has already done that, because when I looked on the website, there was the discussion with people in the north, the climate change one. So I think part of it is to make sure that people have a place to have a voice, and to be able to speak from their own experience, even if it's like not finding necessarily people that are going to agree with you, because dissent can also be productive and generative, right? Like people, you need to have the debate, you need to have the discussion from different perspectives. So I think that's one approach that I have seen that's happened here. I think sometimes what we might be guilty of, that sometimes young people are really good at, is imagination. And what is it like to imagine a good life without the cell phone, without the laptop? Like, I think to myself, I'm this old, like I'm dating myself. I used to get like a memo in my mailbox. Like that's how when I started working. And now I'm like completely inundated with demands all day through email and other spaces. I'm like, how do we ever survive without a cell phone? How do we ever survive? Like people can't even imagine that. Yeah, so I think part of it is just really trying to, which is really hard to do, let go of what we think is like normal or that we should have, and imagine what it would be like to still live well and not necessarily have those kind of things. Somebody mentioned that, the mobiles and the laptops and everything else. There was, and I'll just end with this because I think it's a good question. It was a very, very difficult one, and a not very popular thing that one knowledge keeper, you can find some of his work, Raquel, out of the Grand River Polytech in Six Nations in Ontario. They have their own kind of educational institute, and they have these different videos there, and he does a lot of it. But he's a knowledge holder, and he was giving, he gave a talk based on Haudenosaunee principles, and he's Tuscarora, on what he felt sustainability was or understood. And he was it was this training workshop for government officials, and he said basically we're the generation now that has to like not want our kids and future generations to have what we have, because what we have is actually way too much. We're taking way too much from the earth, and that like blew people away. Of course we want our kids to have better, of course we want our grandkids to have better, but this is a generation where that's not what we should want. We should want different things for them, to have a healthy life, to have clean air to breathe, not have stuff. Yeah, that wasn't really well received. I understood what he meant, because like people can't imagine that. Like why would we ever do that, right? So it's yeah, so I think sometimes we're so great at technology and science and all these other kind of things, but not that great at imagination. How can we imagine ourselves in these kind of situations? Anyway, I'll end there. That was probably a bit too theoretical than grounded. Thank you. It's a good question.
We do need new futurisms, alternative future visions and imaginations, definitely. Thank you so much, Deborah, for these 2 hours. It was quite a long session. I really thank warmly from deep of my heart, and I want to thank all the participants in this session. Thank you very much for all your questions, for your presence here today. And that was the last session of the EXALT Symposium. And now I would like to give the final wrap up for Sofia. Thank you very much, everyone.